everyone, welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. Fresh fighting has broken out in North Ethiopia's Tigray region after roughly 5 months of ceasefire and amid a humanitarian crisis. The government has tried to push back the United States-supported Tigrayan People's Liberation Front or TPLF, which launched a civil war in late 2020. This week, the World Food Programme said almost half of Tigray's 5.5 million population were in severe need of food due to the conflict. The TPLF was a powerful political force in Ethiopia for nearly 3 decades until pro-democracy protests in 2018 shrank it within regional limits and brought Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government to power. We'll speak to Abdul for more on this. Abdul, what has triggered the civil war in Ethiopia?
Well, there are, in fact, if you go by the versions provided by the Ethiopians, they have argued that the change in power in the US after Republican Donald Trump was replaced and Democrats came to power, Joe Biden administration has tried to regain its regional advantages or its regional policy in Horn of Africa, and that is the reason that they backed and provoked the TPLF to basically start their attempt to gain power in Ethiopia. That is the official version of the government in Ethiopia at this moment. They have argued that there is a reason behind it. Of course, the reason behind it is how the way the Ethiopian government and before Abiy came to power was pro-US, and it was also a government which basically tried to play a kind of a supportive role for the US African Command, the US military's presence in Africa.
Okay.
Which has been now in a very disadvantageous position. There is a significant attempt to basically by the US to basically intervene in the region, and that is the you can say the reason for the war to begin in 2020. The war went on for a year, almost a year and a half, and finally in March this year there was an attempt to kind of start negotiation between TPLF and the government of Abiy Ahmed after there was a stalemate. There was both the parties were exhausted, it seems, and again after 5 months we see that there is an attempt to restart the war, and I think we should see it in that context of imperialist game in the Horn of Africa at this moment.
Okay, Abdul. So, Abiy Ahmed has been in power since 2018. Can you talk about what his time in government has been like?
Well, of course, there are significant changes in terms of democracy and the freedom of expression and political mobilizations and all. That is there, of course. That is one advantage. Because of that, of course, he got Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
Apart from that, he also played a very significant role in kind of creating a regional peace. Attempt to achieve a regional peace. His tripartite agreement with Eritrea and Somalia, his attempts to kind of pacify the different kinds of armed movement, the differences between the ethnic groups, kind of create a common ground in the country that basically created a more peaceful, and there was a kind of phase before the war, the US and EU backed war began in 2020, it looked like that reason. Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa, has been a very significant player in the entire African region and in the Horn of Africa. And therefore, Abiy Ahmed's role was primarily to kind of pacify that region and push the region towards economic development, which was needed. Primarily because if you see the reason, there is Somalia, which has been suffering from war because of the particularly because of the presence of Al-Qaeda in the region. And then there has been Eritrea, there has been a long history of war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, when the TPLF was in power. Then South Sudan, there was, of course, attempts to kind of, there was war, and finally kind of division of Sudan and all that. So that entire region, Ethiopia itself had problems between different ethnic groups. So Abiy Ahmed basically tried to resolve all these issues, which, of course, their peace in the region is not favorable to a section of imperialist countries, which basically are trying to, they always see conflict as favorable for various reasons. It provides them a scope for intervention and help them to extract the regional resources in whatever way possible. The peace is, of course, detrimental to their interest, and that basically has not been liked by them. So apart from TPLF, if you see, Abiy Ahmed's government is also facing challenge now from Somalian Al-Qaeda groups. Then there is a Sudanese government military junta in Sudan, which is basically is backing TPLF and other groups. And then there is an attempt to revive the border conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea and so on and so forth. So there is an attempt to destabilize the government in Ethiopia. As I said before, primarily because stability and peace may be serving the people of Ethiopia, will not be favorable for the imperialist interest, the interest which seek trouble in order to maximize their own profit. And that's how we should see this particular conflict and war in that region at this moment.
All right, Abdul, thanks for joining us. And Abdul, we'll be back with you in just another minute. It is 6 months after the Russia-Ukraine conflict that began in February. The EU and the US continue to rely on sanctions against Russia. This has made food grain shortages across the world much more acute and raised prices of fuel. Hundreds of sanctions on banking transactions have hurt other countries more than Russia, and yet the conflict seems nowhere near resolution as predicted early on. We speak to Abdul from People's Dispatch about this. Abdul, what have been the efforts to end this war, and where are they right now?
I don't think there has been any effort so far, any serious attempt, apart from the initial days when there were talks between Ukrainians and Russian in Turkey. Since then, as we have noticed many times, we have talked about it many times in this particular show, how the Western intervention, primarily the intervention by the UK and US, forced the abandonment of that particular path.
Right.
There has been one major achievement in the last 6 months, which is the grain treaty with the intervention of the UN and Turkey, which has basically provided some relief to some of the countries in Africa and in West Asia. Apart from that, even that has a very limited impact on the larger possibilities of peace. If you see the role of US, if you see the role of European Union, which is, despite the fact that it is suffering because of its sanction reliance on sanctions and an attempt to vilify one party of the war and being completely insensitive to the larger concerns raised by the Russians. If you see all of their attempts, it is basically to push Ukrainians to fight on their behalf. It seems they do not want any resolution of the conflict. They want basically it to prolong. If you see, apart from providing them officially the military equipments to Ukrainians to basically attack Russian forces here and there, or what they call defensive mechanism. There are also there has been reports. Some of them are verified, some of them are not verified, about over and above the official sanction amount, there has been a supply of weapon clandestinely in the region. There has been attempt to aid the war of attrition in different parts of Russian controlled region, for example, Crimea or in the Russia itself. The assassination of one of the daughters of a close advisor to Putin.
Right.
So there isn't an attempt, apart from the long vilification process which has been going on through social media and through the mainstream media. There has been no real attempt to reach out to both the parties and try to find a resolution. It seems war is in the favor of certain countries who do not want peace, and that's why we are now marking the six-month anniversary. And if this attempt goes on, it may be longer.
Right, Abdul. Abdul, but the talk about the grain and the fuel and an agreement has been reached. What kind of impact do you see that having so far, and what can we expect in the coming days?
As I said before, the grain agreement has provided some relief to countries in Africa and in West Asia. Apart from that, there has been no positive attempt to kind of undo or lift the sanctions on
Right.
Russia, which would have provided further flow of Russian energy resources or Russian
Grain.
other. Apart from grain, there are other fertilizers and so on
Right.
and so forth, which would have kind of eased the pressure on the prices of commodity, which has basically created a lot of trouble, is creating a lot of troubles in many countries. Europeans are suffering, that is well known. They are, despite the fact that there is a drought, an historical drought, which has created further possibilities of lack of grain within European countries. It has basically also intensified the need of energy resources among Europeans. Despite that, that is the fact which the Europeans also acknowledge. There is no lack of attempt to kind of address this issue is something which we cannot understand. It only can come from come from the fact that Europeans have completely subsisted their own interest to the interest of the United States. There is no other explanation for that. If the European states would have been working for the interest of the people in Europe, they would not have pursued the kind of policies which US is forcing them to pursue. It is primarily given their particular situation. So if we see about the attempts to even revive the nuclear deal with Iran, which would somehow ease some of the pressure on energy crisis in Europe, even that has not been seriously pursued, and the negotiations are dragging on and on. So apart from putting themselves at negative vis-a-vis Russia, the Europeans have also completely surrendered in front of the US, and they are not pursuing any proactive role in other parts of the world also to basically diversify their own sources.
All right, Abdul, thanks a lot for joining us. Thailand's increasingly unpopular Prime Minister has been temporarily suspended by a constitutional court. Prayut Chan-o-cha's suspension is pending a decision on the duration of his rule so far. The hardliner, former military chief, has been Prime Minister since he seized power in a 2014 coup. Throughout his time in power, Thailand has cracked down on dissent and political opponents. The constitution was revised in 2017 and he was returned to power in a 2019 election. The time bar to remain as Prime Minister is 8 years in Thailand. So the court must now decide which year Chan-o-cha's term began. It could bar him or allow him to remain Prime Minister perhaps for another 5 years. Let's talk to Anish from People's Dispatch about this development. Anish, can you start by telling us what Prayut Chan-o-cha's term in power since 2014 has been like?
Well, I mean, he began as the chairperson of the coup regime that was established in May 2014, which happened. The coup itself, let's begin with that, happened in the middle of a general election that came about because of a political crisis, and that spanned about 6 months between 2013 and 2014. And even before the votes could be completed, the entire process was scuttled. The military claimed that it was a rigged voting system for some reason. They never proved how it was rigged, despite massive protest on the streets by democratic activists at the time. The coup went ahead and established itself a junta that that pretty much took power and has been having some level of control even after a nominally civilian government has come into effect since 2017. Now, Prayut's tenure pretty much marked uh, itself with how deeply entrenched the military made itself into the system. One of the things, like the first 3 years of his regime, was obviously marked by how they were trying to control any kind of democratic protest at the time, social movements that were trying to push for more democratic systems, or at least a new constitution. And when the new constitution did come into effect, it was also quite interesting to see how they did not allow for any amount of canvassing or about the new constitution. There was no public debate. There was nothing whatsoever. They pretty much, prevented anybody from talking about it and just put a referendum into place. So people were just more concerned about having a new constitution and a civilian government, and they were just not aware, most of them, about what this new government would look like. And when it did come into effect, we saw how entrenched the military regime would be, because we have to remember that the upper house is pretty much military appointed, and it's the upper house and the lower house in the parliament that actually votes together for the government. So pretty much any kind of, even if there was a pro-democratic political party that might win a majority in the lower house tomorrow, it is still going to have to deal with the upper house, still has considerable amount of power in its hands. And we also have to remember most of the local governments that existed were also military appointed, and which was, I mean, obviously until recently we saw some elections happening, and in all of those cases, many of the time, it was the pro-military regime that was on the back foot. So in many ways, the government was unpopular. There was also deeply problematic stuff that was done during the counting of the 2019 elections, where they kind of manipulated the system in such a way that smaller parties that were not eligible to have representation in the House in the proportional representation system were given seats just so that they could be able to support the military regime in the lower house as well. So this was the sort of manipulation and, the kind of military manipulation of the system that they say is democratic, that was marked throughout Prayut's reign. And apart from that, we had political repression going around, political parties being dissolved. The Constitutional Court, let's remember, was always this fallback support system for the military regime, dissolving political parties, arresting political leaders and opponents, and even banning an entire social movement that happened in demanding reform in the monarchy. But even all of that, I mean, this was obviously a surprise from them, but all of this was definitely part of the Prayut's legacy, lasting legacy. And obviously that is what he will be remembered for.
Anish, now there's talk about holding elections. Is that going to really change a lot?
As I said, the lasting legacy of Prayut's would be the constitutional system that was brought in. It is kind of like a civic military system in place. So there will definitely be the shadow of military's power in influencing any decision that any future civilian pro-democratic power might take. There is definitely major support for pro-democratic forces. Opposition parties have been gaining support in recent times.
Right.
But we are not sure how far that might be the case. we didn't see much difference in the voting behavior in the 2019 elections and the 2011, 10-11 elections last, where the regions that voted for pro-military and pro-monarchy parties voted for the same kind of parties in 2019. So it wasn't much different. But we did see in the Bangkok election, the governor elections, there was a difference that happened for the first time in a decade, more than a decade, that a pro-democratic and an anti, if not an anti-monarchy or anti-military, but definitely a pro-democratic candidate won with a huge margin, one of the biggest margins in recent history. So definitely there is some level of influence that the recent democratic protests have had in the voting behaviors. But the elections were obviously set to be held in 2023 at the very least, because that's the tenure of a government as per their own constitution that they created. So it was obviously right around the corner. The ruling party that was pro-Prayut and pro-monarchy and like controlling the monarchy, like not controlling the monarchy, but expanding the powers of the monarchy, were the back foot. And this time we are not sure how significant it would be if an election were to be held. But pro-democratic forces are not out. They're still strong. They're still fighting. And the resistance on the grassroots are much bigger than we could have remembered in recent years. So definitely that is going to have a bigger impact in how, even if the compromised political system continues, it is still going to influence a lot of how the political elite is going to behave in the coming days.
Right, Anish, and that also might help us understand why the court has given the ruling it has right now.
Exactly.
Thanks a lot for joining us. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. We'll be back with more stories like these tomorrow. You can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for updates from around the world, or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.